Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School, and I blog at danieldrezner.com.
Hi, my name is Elvin Lim. I'm a professor at Wesleyan University, and I blog at www.elvinlim.com.
And you are also the author of?
Oh, that's right. The author of The Anti-Intellectual Presidency that was just recently out by Oxford Press in May this year.
Yes, in which you argue that the state of presidential rhetoric has moved towards an anti-intellectual bent. Is that correct?
Yeah, I argue that whereas Presidents George Washington and through most of the 18th and 19th century presidents infused their speeches with a lot of substance, the contemporary presidents have been rather thin on offering both policy substance and argumentative substance in their recent speeches.
All right, well, this is a good segue. We are speaking the morning after John McCain's acceptance speech for the Republican nomination, and 2 days after Sarah Palin's acceptance for the vice presidential nomination. Why don't we start with the McCain speech? Elvin, what did you think of it?
I thought that the speech was extremely thin on substance, especially in contrast to Obama. I don't want to make this as a partisan claim. I will say that Obama had to infuse his acceptance speech with a lot of substance because there was the charge of him being a celebrity, being all talk and no substance, and so he was forced, against, I'm sure, his own will, to infuse quite a lot of policy specificity into his speech. McCain, on the other hand, was doing something very different last night. I think he was trying to speak to independents, and he was concerned not so much to tell independents, here's where I want to take America, but he was more concerned to say, I'm the guy to take you there. Mm-hmm. So, there was really just the middle part of the speech where he engaged in policy speech, where he talked about education and
trade
and educating the people, skilled workers. But then he moved on very, very quickly to show up his maverick credentials, deal with the objection that, the Republican Party may be tarnished, but I'm my own man. And so it was really a biography of what he has achieved in his life, his record, his scars, as he put it, and much less a speech about where exactly he'll take us. Now, Obama did that, admittedly, again, not because it was his instinct to do so, but because the McCain campaign, in a way, preempted that option by saying, look, you better put more bones, more meat on the bones. McCain, on the other hand, was free, I think, to go down this path of really trying only to persuade his audience rather than to educate them.
Do you think he really was that free? I mean, I grant you that McCain hasn't been, criticized as much for the lack of policy specifics, but in some ways that almost is because, everyone, most Republicans acknowledge that Obama is very good at giving a speech, that they think his rhetoric is quite good. And that's, in fact, the way the Republicans have attacked Obama by saying, oh, yes, he gives a great speech, to indicate that there's no actual substance. And I think it was the gap between that and substance that forced Obama's hand. On the other hand, no one thinks that John McCain gives a great speech. And so as a result, the gap wasn't that great. But, as we're talking, for example, the unemployment figures were released this morning, and, unemployment is at its highest rate in 5 years. I kind of have to wonder, as, people are more concerned about the economy, if McCain is actually going to suffer from the fact that he didn't put any policy specifics in the speech.
When you say what makes a great speech, I unfortunately have to concede that very often what makes a great speech has nothing to do with what the substance was. Right. I think that it's got to do with delivery. After all, McCain, as we all know, doesn't give a great grand speech, but he's very good at town hall meetings, and that was probably why they lowered their podium last night to replicate more of a town hall setting, and he was more comfortable being himself. Mm-hmm. I certainly agree that the economy, the numbers coming out won't do him any good. But I think he did a pretty good job of dealing with the bad news by saying, look, I'm the maverick. This whole speech was about how you can't stick, the bad record of the Bush administration on me. I'm the maverick here. So all this bad news is not going to stick to me because, remember, he even brought up immigration to prove that he was a feisty maverick. And look,
I thought the most powerful evidence of the maverick point was, he had that line about, we were elected to go change Washington, but Washington changed us. And you have to give McCain credit. That's not normally a line that you hear the acceptance speech, delivered to his own party. That was an odd, it's a statement against interest in some ways.
Absolutely. I think that the argument moved with, first, let's have contrition. I think the speech was really addressed to independents.
I agree.
Palin did the raw meat, the red meat, and this was addressed to independents. And the first part of that was to say, look, I admit that we haven't been the best party for this country in the last 8 years. And then the second part was, even as I concede guilt on my party's part, I'm as guilt-free as anyone could have been because I was a maverick. And then he moves on to his biography and talks about him being a POW and how he's the man for these times. So in a way, he's moving in the stage to cast himself, further and further out from the person that will take the shoulder to blame for the bad news that's coming out. And I think that was a preeminently political and strategic choice on his part.
Again, the stagecraft was just awful. As we talked about, as you said, McCain gave the best speech that a John McCain could give, but that's not very good. And then also, this is thoroughly shallow, but if you watch the speech, you saw him behind a green screen to begin with, and then a blue screen after that. And when they panned back, it was obvious why. It was because there were, these larger backdrops, but it just looked awful.
Yeah, I think that there was also the flag that was waving through most of it. Sometimes it looked cheap, sometimes it looked rousing, depending on the tenor and tone of his speech and where he was at that time. Look, I think he was extremely uncomfortable. For instance, last night when he came out with Palin, he was just standing there. He didn't know what to do.
You mean the night before when Palin gave?
Sorry, the night before when he came out, he was so awkward. He didn't know what to do. He was standing there with so much applause. He didn't know what to do with it. And I think they knew that they had to recognize that this man was only authentic when he was not dealing with big crowds. And so I agree with you that the stagecraft was bad. I even think that the balloons were a little excessive. I hear that John McCain likes the balloons. But I have to say that we have to explain why, this morning's poll from CBS put him at 42-42, which basically means that he has, probably mostly due to Palin's speech, narrowed that gap, that 8-point gap that the Obama campaign had managed to create out of their convention bump. And it's all gone now. It's 42-42 according to CBS. And the poll also showed that we have basically the 6-point lead among independents that Obama once had down to 3. And so, for some reason, McCain has managed to narrow the gap not only with his Republican base, but also with independents.
That's true. Although, I think we need to wait a few days to see how the bounce actually.
That's true.
It's only one poll. But to some extent, what will wind up happening is that the conventions wind up being a wash then. Because roughly, before the Democratic convention, it was approximately about a 3-point. It was a small margin, but a definite margin for Obama in most of the polls that I'd seen. Yeah,
I think, if anything, there is a very slight net gain in favor of the Republicans. Remember that everyone was saying that this is going to tank with the Palin choice, and there was just so much media brouhaha over it that we expected that this convention bump, the Republican side, to be extremely muted, especially because of Gustav, and they only had 3 days compared to the Democrats having 4. Right. Considering the circumstances, I think this was really a net gain for the Republicans, given where they started.
Okay. And, well, this is a nice segue to Palin's speech, which, in some ways I think got much better reception, a much better critical reception.
Absolutely. And here I think the point I make in my book becomes especially pertinent, because a great speech by today's contemporary criteria is one that creates applause lines and gets the base going. But as I argue, a great speech is very often one that does not infuse it with arguments that invite other people into the public sphere to debate matters of importance in politics. And this was exactly one of them. It was a great speech, but it was just punchline after punchline, and there was really very little substance in it. Now, liberals are going to say that it was snide. Conservatives are going to say that it was on point. But the two shall not greet. The two will not address each other, because this was just such a highly partisan speech that was dedicated only to generate applause and not to invite debate with the other side. So I concede that this was an extremely effective speech, but I don't think it did anything to help promote public deliberation.
I don't know if it promoted public deliberation, but I would disagree with you in terms of it being effective rhetoric. You talk in the book about how there are 3 components of good rhetoric, right? The appeal to logic, the appeal to ethics, and then the appeal to pathos. And the Palin speech, I think, logic really didn't play a big role, but logic didn't play a big role in most of these speeches. I mean, and I agree with you on that, the general assessment. But the ethos and pathos, I think, did work in Palin's case. The reason that Palin was perceived to be appealing was, she presented herself as not someone, who had been tied to the Washington establishment, or for that matter, even the Alaska establishment. That, she had, by conventional political standards, an unusual background, and that therefore you could trust her. And furthermore, the tone of the delivery of the speech I thought was actually very effective. That even though she was doing a lot of cutting lines, it was done with a sort of light, inflection that I think, in a way that someone like Mitt Romney could never have gotten away with.
Absolutely. I've spoken to both liberals and conservatives on this, and I think in general, the Obama supporters thought that she was extremely sarcastic and a little snide, and of course, the Republicans thought that she was on point and addressed the objections really well. She came out confident, swinging, despite all the negative media attention that had come before, the day before. But
which wound up being in some ways, I think, a blessing for her, because there was so much, critical, there was so much, investigation into her. She was a huge unknown. The obvious thing a lot of people thought was, Danielle Quayle or something like that, and she gave she exceeded expectations in the speech.
Absolutely, and in politics, it's all about the expectations game. I think that the Democrats after that speech were really, really frightened. I mean, they were quivering at the thought of someone that could really vivify the base, and she did exactly that.
Right.
And the other thing I want to add also is I think she's given she's in a way inventing a new form of feminism here. I mean, this is someone who. I think her best line, I think most people agree, was the difference between a hockey mom and a pit bull and a stick. It's a very, very peculiar kind of feminism, because this was also someone who unabashedly called McCain my guy. Mm-hmm. So it's a brand of feminism that's both powerful and yet also endorses a lot of traditional, more or less more Republican conceptions of a woman's role that I think we'll have to study a lot more in the future, especially contrasting her brand of feminism with Hillary Clinton's, because let it be said that probably the only reason why she's on the ticket was because Hillary first made gender an issue.
Mm-hmm. Actually, the thing I thought, looking at the two speeches combined, and actually the sort of more general, tone of the Republican convention, it struck me there was a contradiction at the heart of it, because part of what Palin did, so effectively, I actually thought the most effective line she said was, talking about what being a mayor was like. It's kind of like being a community organizer, except with actual responsibility.
Correct.
I thought that was actually, it was an effective jab in some ways. Except the odd thing was that, a lot of the speakers wound up harping on Obama, Obama's track record as a community organizer. And yet, the whole convention ended with, the McCain's peroration for service. Calling for national service, go out, run for office, do all these things. He didn't say this, but becoming a community organizer would have been one of the natural, outcomes of that peroration.
That's right. I think I was just listening to a commentator on MSNBC saying that there's something complicated about saying that you want to value your own experience, but also say that experience constitutes being marred by the ways of Washington. And look, I think, of course, there's an inconsistency there, and I speak only to the strategy by which McCain attempted to break out of the seeming inconsistency. And I think he did that by saying that, look, what I have is not a history of being marred by Washington, but instead I have the scars of being a POW. I have the scars of being there. I have the scars of breaking out and being a maverick in this game. I played the game and I've been hurt occasionally, but I understand it. And I think he tried to show that he should be known not for his record in Washington, but for the scars that he has borne for his service to his country. It's a fine line trying to break out of this contradiction, but we'll see if it works.
But it's also a very dangerous line of argument. On the one hand, it's certainly potent. The most potent part of McCain's biography is the fact that he spent 5 years as a prisoner of war, and no one really, criticized him for that. On the other hand, to what extent does it wind up dangerously slipping into, vote for me, I've earned this?
Look, I think what he did with the POW thing is, first let me first say that this is of course a treasure trove that keeps giving. Not a single person on the Republican convention on the podium failed to mention the POW history. Now that's just a political capital that will keep giving. But I think what McCain also tried to do, and I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt here, was to attempt to say that, look, there are two conceptions of patriotism here, and I'm going to caricaturize them for the purpose of argument.
Yeah.
Liberals love their country by feeling the guilt, by seeing what it could have been. And conservatives love their country by having pride in it as it is right now. So there's both the promise of a city on a hill, which liberals care about, and the actuality of a city on a hill that conservatives emphasize. And I think by emphasizing service to his country and the fact that he fought, McCain was trying to do both, to amalgamate both conceptions of patriotism here, to say that, look, I think that we're a great country, yes, our ideals are probably superior to those in another country, but we also have to fight, like the fight that I was in a cell in Hanoi, to show that we could reach the city on the hill. And so I don't think he was necessarily just saying that I love this country, therefore elects me. I think he was also saying I'm a fighter, fight for me. Because remember the loud peroration of his speech where he got really feisty. The only time I really seen him it was about fighting. It was fighting for a better tomorrow in a way that appealed, I think, to independent voters who saw a little bit of the other side of the patriotism argument as understood by liberals. And that is that we not only live in a city on a hill, we have to aspire toward it. And the fighting part, I think, mapped onto that part of liberal patriotism.
Well, this gets to a larger question, I think, which is, to what extent did you notice any differences in terms of, rhetorical styles between the Republican and the Democratic conventions? I mean, we have, unfortunately, time has caused me to forget an awful lot of the Obama and Biden speeches. But I mean, more generally, do you think, you talk about one way in which Republicans appeal differently, which is, they talk about fighting and talking about, warts and all, I love my country, whereas Democrats just, hope about it being better. I mean, what other differences would you say there are?
Yeah, let me just elaborate on the last point.
Okay.
It seems to me that the modal chant that you hear on a Republican convention floor is USA, USA, USA. The modal chant you hear on a Democratic convention floor is yes we can, yes we can. And I think that implies something. Yes we can says no we have not yet. It says that we can get there but we're not quite there yet. USA just means we are already there. This is it. This is great. And it seems to me that these are, as I had argued before, different conceptions of what patriotism means on both parties. But to get on to more details here, I think that both sides are engaged in pushing partisan punchlines in a way that, as I argue in my book, doesn't necessarily promote debate. One side's going to say, basically I'm pro-choice. The other side's basically going to say, basically I'm pro-life. And all that occurs here is two categorical claims are set up on either side of the argument. And there's really no need to bridge the middle, to come to a point of that will break out of this logical impasse. Because after all, what could be more sacred than life? And what could be more sacred than choice, liberty, autonomy? And I think what both parties...
I, for one, always put the pursuit of happiness above both of those. That's my general rule.
Which, by the way, has been a very effective strategy of avoiding the problems involved in logical inconsistencies, because my own explanation for why Jefferson put in pursuit of happiness rather than property was because, A, I think property had too many overtones that refers to the peculiar institution. Yeah. But B, and B, happiness also is one of those things that people can't disagree on. It's one of those things where a statement can be both platitudinous, i.e. vacuous, but also profound. And I think that is one of the strategies of the anti-intellectual presidents. They have articulated seeming truisms to cross the divide in a way that all presidents in a bell-shaped curve between left and right, median voter theory, have had to do. They've had to speak to the middle and in fact say nothing, or at least say something to mean something to both sides. And happiness does exactly that. And I think that's why liberals disagree with conservatives about how Reagan was or was not an anti-intellectual president. Conservatives say that he was very profound. He used great ideas, and liberals say, but what did they mean? In the same way, by the way, that Obama is the liberal analog to that problem today. What does change mean? And conservatives are now getting the taste of their own medicine because they're getting annoyed. Exactly what does Obama mean? And now, to be sure, Obama tried to address this problem by saying in his acceptance speech, let me now specify what change means. And then he goes on to say, we're going to lower tax rates for 95% of the American people, etc. But nonetheless, I think, as Hillary Clinton correctly put it, throughout most of this campaign, he had vacillated on the platitude of change without filling in the details. He offered the poetry, as Hillary Clinton said, and she instead offered the prose. And it seems to me then that the difference...
Elvin, just to push back, this depends on whether or not you consider a candidate's rhetoric alone in a vacuum, or whether you consider the candidate's rhetoric in addition to the actual concrete policy proposals they put forward. Both. If you went to the Obama and the Clinton websites, Obama, if I remember correctly, had just as detailed policy proposals. He just didn't talk about them as much.
True.
This does lead to the interesting question of to what extent does rhetoric have to include these kinds of details, particularly in an age where if people want those kinds of details, they know where they can get them, or they know that they can get them elsewhere.
Now, I agree that we don't need to have a rhetoric that is infused maximally with substance. What I fear is not so much, honestly, that we end up in an entirely vacuous space, which, by the way, I think the data suggests. I measured the readability of speeches from everything that George Washington ever said to almost everything that George Bush said. And I showed that whereas George Washington spoke at a college level, Bill Clinton and George Bush spoke at about a 6th to an 8th grade level. And if this continues, and the data is a monotonic trend, if the data continues as it does, in about 100 years, we're going to have speeches speak at roughly the 5th grade level, which is the level of comic strip books. But that said, I'm not even sure that I'm personally convinced that is the most problematic part about an entirely emptied out public space. What I'm more worried about is that people are throwing partisan punchlines at each other to preclude the debate rather than to promote it, which is the exact opposite of what democracy should be. What's the point of political rhetoric? What's the point of political communication? These days, it's just to sell. It's to get someone on board, to have him in the White House, and there is, as Thomas Mann argues, a convergence between the rhetoric of governance, the rhetoric of campaigning, selling versus governing. Go ahead.
Let me say two things on this. The first is that one of the ironies about this is correct me if I'm wrong. You're a political theorist. Is that a?
No, I'm more a behavioralist.
Oh, okay, all right. But one of the things one of the things I always find ironic is when politicians behave exactly as political scientists predict they will behave. And essentially what your book does is accusing politicians of doing that very thing, which is they're primarily interested in winning elections. Ergo, they are going to pursue the rhetorical strategies that they think will maximize the likelihood of them winning elections. So I can't damn them for that completely, because that's what I would do if I was a politician.
Right.
But the second thing is it's funny, you were talking about partisan jabs in both the conventions. What struck me, and maybe this is focusing particularly on Obama and McCain's speeches, is actually, you could almost play, acceptance speech bingo, and there would be a lot of similar tropes on both speeches. Both of them talked about energy independence, which, by the way, is a complete pipe dream, in terms of actual policy. But, it sounds nice. Both of them talked about working across the aisle to get things done. Both of them talked about the idea of service. Obama also brought up this concept of service. They both talked about that. Both of them talked about a strong, America. There was a whole variety of both of them talked about, working with American allies. There are some differences. I don't disagree with that. But what struck me was just how many, there was not a lot of daylight on a lot of the themes that both of them pushed pretty hard
on. That's right. I think that there's a core, maybe you can even call it an American creed, that both sides will recite. In a way that presidents will recite in an inaugural address. It's just a string of obvious truths that you will hear in every 4 years. There's a recitation of obvious truths that quadrennially is articulated in these inaugural addresses. And the same thing happens in these acceptance speeches. But let me address your first point about my book accusing politicians of doing the very thing that political scientists predict they will. I think that's about right. But I do want to add this caveat. I think it has become very common intuition to blame the people. In a way, what we're saying is, if politicians have to do this to win, we're basically saying that the people desire it and therefore they shall have it, i.e. they shall have anti-intellectual speech. Mm-hmm. Let me first say that this is an unfair characterization of the problem, at least insofar as people don't have a reason to read the newspapers and find out about politics. In delegated politics, what we have is people delegating their power to their representatives to do their homework for them. So what's really happening is we have the paradox of information acquisition. That is, people do not need to acquire information because their vote will have a very small chance of making a difference, qua the paradox of voting. And so correspondingly, they also have very little reason to acquire this information. They assume that their representatives will do the work for them. Now, what's interesting about anti-intellectual presidents is that they exploit a collective action problem, i.e. the collective action problem of citizens acquiring information. And more precisely, I call it a cheap ride on a free ride in my book, where we have politicians exploiting the lack of motivation of citizens to acquire information, rather than to take the path of least resistance, to educate these people. They instead exploit voters for their ignorance, to push their buttons, and to use framing and priming and the ignorance of people to get to the conclusions that aren't obviously what the people want. And that's what I find problematic about anti-intellectualism. I don't necessarily think that they are justified in doing what they're doing. In fact, I think that they're taking what I call a cheap ride on a free ride, and that's unfair.
Well, I don't disagree completely with that. I mean, I think you're right in the book. You point out that, the argument of, oh, well, people are just trying to identify with a common man. I think you do a nice job of sort of poking holes at claims in rhetoric that simplicity is better because it appeals to the common person. That it's, in fact, possible to be eloquent, simple, and still make, actual logical arguments in favor of something. You did a nice job of contrasting, for example, the reasons that George Bush made for going for war to Iraq with those of Tony Blair. And Blair didn't use terribly much more sophisticated language, but he actually articulated arguments. The one thing, though, I would push back on this. The one thing you didn't mention in the book, which I was surprised about, was the fact that the media now exists as a filter between presidential rhetoric and the public in a way that I don't know necessarily was the case even 100 years ago, where if the president delivered a State of the Union address, it was just sort of reprinted, and that way, individuals could simply read it as they wished. The fact is that, more people get their information out from television or the internet than they do from print. And the way in which that information is packaged, not necessarily by the president, but rather by media outlets, almost forces them to focus on the soundbite.
You're absolutely right. I think the manner in which information is transmitted necessarily changes the message itself. Mm-hmm. And obviously, television and radio has made it more efficient for politicians and speakers to shorten their sentences, to create sound bites, and etc. I think the media, however, doesn't have to propel this anti-intellectual tendency. For instance, if you look at the internet and the blogosphere, or the newspaper outlets that are now turning to the print media, the internet media, we find that, in essence, we are moving away from the oral culture, the internet. I think the oral culture had a big part in causing this dumbing down that has occurred, in part because when you can speak rather than write, you are not invited to think through the entire sentence, the entire thought before you say it, because you can stop and stop, as I just did. Whereas if you were to write something out, you have to be really clear exactly what you were saying before you wrote it all out. If not, you had no opportunity to go back to rewrite it, to re-say it. And so genre matters, i.e. oral versus textual, and the internet has helped, I think, to revive something of a textual genre. Let it be said also that Woodrow Wilson decided to change the mode of delivery of the State of the Union address in 1913 from a written message to an oral message. We could actually find a discernible effect on the simplicity of the speech. If that's the case, then this return to the oral genre via the internet may hold some hope for us. It's not obviously clear that the media will perpetrate what presidents are doing with their speeches. In fact, there may be a little bit of a reverse dynamic going on here.
All right, just to depress you, I mean, I hope you're correct, but that said, I actually think there are countervailing arguments against it in two ways. First, the introduction of video on the web actually, if anything, exacerbates this soundbite thing. I mean, think about YouTube and the extent to which, the average YouTube clip that you're going to want to watch is not that long. It's less than a television program. It's like usually 2 minutes might be a long time on YouTube. And so therefore, particularly, I'm thinking of like Talking Points Memo, for example, likes to have these sort of summaries of what people say. But, it's often, 3, 4, 5 minute things tops. And so as a result, it's actually less time to which you can engage the viewer. So that's one problem. The other problem is the way text is read on the internet as opposed to on the page, on an actual page, which is generally, and this is my understanding, if you're writing text, let's say for a blog post, and I know I do this on my blog, you have to keep shorter paragraphs.
That's true.
Because you don't want the reader constantly scrolling down and thinking, my God, this is a long block of unindented prose. Oh, dear God. So as a result, does that change the style of writing in a way that actually makes it simplified?
You're probably right. In a way, what you're saying is human nature will rear its ugly head, whether it be on television or on the internet. Mm-hmm. And the same may be true. And it's probably some effects of self-selection, too. If you were on the internet, if you were someone that typically went to television for news, you would just go for a video on the internet. If you were someone that wanted text, you would go straight to, say, the online edition of the New York Times. Which is why I argue in my book that ultimately the problem, if it started top-down, must also be solved top-down. I don't have very much hope in a bottom-up solution. In the media helping us restore the health of the public sphere, I think it has to be a top-down problem solution to a top-down problem. After all, I interviewed 42 speechwriters in my book, and every last one of them, well, okay, I'll say 85 to 90% of them said, look, that's been dumbing down. And I say, look, this is really hypocritical that the very people who have written these speeches also complain about dumbing down. Now, who do we have to blame other than the speechwriters themselves? And I think then that there's something like a group think within the Washington establishment that the only way to write a great speech is to dumb down. It's a group think that, by the way, as individuals, each of these speechwriters disagree with. And I think therein the paradox suggests to us that perhaps this is just groupthink. Perhaps it is possible that we may infuse rhetoric, as, say, Franklin Roosevelt did in his fireside chat, with some substance, not too much. And perhaps such speeches may in fact stand out from the morass of path that has emerged from the Rose Garden garbage from the White House.
Well, I mean, I think my take on this is that the only way you're going to correct this trend that you identify, and as you point out in the book, this is a nonpartisan trend. It doesn't matter the party of the presidency. In fact, actually, what I found fascinating was that the highest score, or the most simplistic language in the papers of any administration was Lyndon Johnson's, which I would not have expected.
Yeah.
But I think the only way you're going to reverse that trend and reverse that groupthink is actually for someone to run, for the presidency on an intellectual, as an intellectual candidate, and then win. And that automatically reverses the thinking, which is the moment someone wins using a strategy that contradicts the conventional wisdom, the new strategy becomes the conventional wisdom. Now, this leads to a very interesting question, which I'll put to you, which is, do you think either of these candidates, Obama or McCain, if they get elected, people will look at them and think, wow, they really did it differently. They actually engaged in the issues. They engaged in, in logos as well as ethos and pathos.
I think it's going to become increasingly hard for Obama to make that claim. I think a few months ago, perhaps he could have legitimately made the claim, but if he continues as he does, it will be harder, I think. But I will say that he has tried very hard to keep this campaign above board. He did this particularly with the fight with Hillary Clinton, and we'll see. I mean, he did not take the path of attacking Palin.
Yeah.
He tried to keep things above board. I'm not sure if this will continue, especially if they see the polls closing. He's already been told that he has to go on the attack mode. Now, there's nothing necessarily anti-intellectual about attacking, but I personally don't think that there's any place in that in our politics. Let me quickly address your point about Lyndon Johnson to make a larger point. Lyndon Johnson's speech was simplistic because he was fighting against expectations that he was the vice president of John Kennedy. In the same way that George Herbert Walker Bush had to not even try to infuse his speeches with high rhetoric was because he was fighting against Ronald Reagan. And you will find that every time there was a great speaker, say Franklin Roosevelt, the person that followed had to say, I'm not even going to try oratory. I'm going to make things simple to show that I'm authentic. I'm not going to try to be something that I'm not. In a way, the message of simplicity has become the signal to people that presidents are authentic. Funnily enough, authenticity is derived from the simplicity of language rather than the sincerity that underlie the words.
But wouldn't this be a reason to be optimistic? Because George W. Bush has taken this to a new level in terms of, I mean, the words in which he's often, made famous, you're with us or against us, we're going to get those killers. The various caricatures of George W. Bush have made him seem not just simple, but almost a simpleton, which he clearly isn't. But, I mean, regardless. And he also has, an incredibly low approval rating. So is this the opportunity for the next president to think, I am not going to be George W. Bush. I'm going to demonstrate intellect?
I think this is what Obama was trying to do. He was trying to say that leadership via gut instinct is very different from leadership via, getting advice from my advisors and thinking issues through. And I think that's exactly what liberals want. I'm just not sure if conservatives will buy that argument. I mean, there is something to be said about a partisan divide here, even about the modes of leadership between gut and, say, deliberation. And there's something to be said for gut, as I posted in one of my recent posts on my blog, where gut reviews authenticity, whereas people argue that too much thinking implies that you are a crafty, strategic, manipulating, inauthentic leader. And I think many conservatives trusted George Bush, even if his conclusions were wrong, but they trusted him precisely because he was true to his gut. But of course, I come back to this point that ours is a democracy where we cannot allow our leaders to proceed via their guts, because leaders in a democracy have to demonstrate the reasons for their actions rather than the guts behind their actions. You can't prove guts. And in a democracy, we expect much more than instinct. We need to be able to deliberate the reasons for and against a course of action. Now, as a matter of campaigning rhetoric, it seems to me that gut does tend to work more often than deliberation. As a matter of governmental rhetoric, I think we all agree that there is a far bigger place for deliberation than for gut. And so perhaps what we have is, once again, a tension between what is required to win a campaign versus what is required to lead the country.
Well, on that cheery note, I think we need to close out. But I mean, I would agree with you. I mean, this is one. I was actually surprised you didn't mention this more in the book, but it's true. As the campaign process has gotten longer, and as candidates, for lack of a better way of putting it, move down the learning curve, I always wondered to what extent there's a path-dependent effect of once you know what to do to win an election, you simply apply those lessons to actually governing, and they don't translate necessarily that well.
Yeah, I think it's not only path-dependent, but it's path-accelerating. The more someone does it, as I argue about anti-intellectualism, the more the other would dumb down even more to prove that he was more authentic, more instinctual, more guttural, more visceral.
Right,
so it's escalating tendency.
I have to close this then with the following question. Elvin, have you seen the movie Idiocracy?
No, I have not.
I highly encourage you to go check it out, because I actually think Idiocracy is your worst nightmare come true. It's an argument. It's an argument that the country gets progressively dumber over time, and so like the president 300 years from now or something is like a former professional wrestler or something like that.
Let me quickly say before my critics jump on me that I don't think the American people are stupid. I only think that presidents presume Americans are stupid and therefore give them the lowest common denominator.
Okay.
Yeah.
And with that note, we are not talking down to people. Elvin, it was a pleasure, and good luck, hawking the book, among other things.
Thanks very much. Good talking to you.
All right, bye.
Bye.